Today we're going to talk about mainly focus on the fourth shift, which is from threat to opportunity, but with a particular focus on human rights. What are we asking people to do when we ask them to support our cause? What does it mean to do human rights, not just receive human rights or have human rights taken away? I said this last time that essentially narrative at a really basic level, and I often, when I do sessions, try not even to talk too much about narrative, because really working on narrative is about trying to repeat our message over and over again in a simple way, in a way that connects to people's emotions and their experiences and their identity, and also that makes other people want to repeat it as well, whether they're cultural figures or leaders, and above all, actually ordinary people, the people who agree with us. And so to me, the building blocks of a strategy or narrative are these three things you see on the side. So it's our message, what we say, the idea we're trying to get across, the story. So what is it we actually do? What does that message actually look like when people act on it? And the stories that get told, that get elevated every day, are the stories that end up creating the narrative. So in migration, for example, if there's one incident, say, of someone from another country committing a crime, and that will become the one story, suddenly the narrative will become, for most people, oh, these outsiders come in, threaten our security, they don't respect our culture. Whereas there may be 99 other stories of migrants really contributing to their community. Those stories don't get told. They don't contribute to the narrative. That's part of our challenge in the way we do a lot of our human rights work today, because we're always focusing on that one story, but we're not showing this examples of when you have human rights and when people act on human rights. And the other crucial piece is the audience. Who are we talking to? For narrative, it's also really important not just to think of persuadable audiences, so people whose mind we want to change, but the people who agree with us, the people who most share our values. Are we helping them to actually express that point of view? So for example, on migration, you've got all the people who actually think, well, why can't we just help people? Why can't we welcome new people into our community? I like living in a diverse society. The people who actually are most likely to articulate that first block, our message, often will stay quiet, because you remember that Overton window? Our ideas feel taboo if they see centrist politicians like, say, Hillary Clinton or Tony Blair saying, oh, migration is really a problem. We need to be tough on migration. Similarly, on the other side, sort of racist ideas that feel taboo, people won't articulate them. But if they start to see influential people, leaders of their society articulate those views, then it starts to become okay for them to say it. So a key part of narrative is really actually, can we just get the people who agree with us to articulate these views more so that they're more salient in the public debate? We're going to focus today on actually, so what is this message? What is the story we want to tell about human rights? Because if our goal is just to repeat our message as much as possible, then what actually is that story around human rights that we want to tell? And one thing that populists, nationalists are really good at, ironically, is working together across borders to tell the same story. So for example, around coronavirus, the story that, oh, can't have these lockdowns because they're going to hurt the economy. You'll see that in one country and then suddenly it spreads all over. Or say attacks on Soros and OSF. But we all believe, I think, in human rights and something universal, and yet a lot of our work is quite segmented into our national countries. But if we want to change the story around human rights, we, all of us in all our different countries, need to have a certain sense that the underlying story we're telling, even if we use different words and different specific stories, are somehow connected, that we're building up this idea we want people to have around human rights. But so I just want to do 10-15 minutes on this shift of threat to opportunity. So you'll remember I showed you the human brain at the beginning, and I talked about the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. And what happens when we trigger and when we activate that downstairs brain, the fear, outrage, activating people's self-preservation. So a lot of human rights messaging is actually activating that downstairs brain. So this is an advertisement I'm not going to show you because it's not Hobe-based. I think it was Save the Children in around 2015, 2016. On the left-hand side is what happens at the beginning of the video. You see a British child celebrating her birthday, living a normal life. And then war comes to the United Kingdom, and suddenly the child has to flee for her life, and you see her basically living through the scenes of basically what's happening in what was happening in Syria, so that by the end of the video, this child, who could be your child, for our UK audience, is in a refugee camp. And so what this is basically saying is, imagine this was you. Imagine these things happening to those people suddenly happen to you. So this is what we call, this is an empathic pain response. So we're asking someone to feel the pain of someone who's suffering. But the problem is the human brain resists the pain response because it's emotionally painful. we don't want to imagine ourselves in this position of suffering. It's why, for example, sometimes the people who are closest to poverty are least likely to identify with people in poverty and support policies to alleviate poverty, because you tell yourself, oh, that wouldn't happen to me. If you see a homeless person, you might imagine, well, this could happen to anyone. You say, no, but I would work hard. I would make sure that doesn't happen to me. So just like there's this confirmation bias, right? When we try and use facts to tell people that they're wrong, and you end up actually repeating the message first of all, and then reinforcing them in their position, is this sense of our brain was going to resist taking on this message. But crucially, what I want us to think about today is, how does human rights work? So remember I said with audience research I'd done before, the key question that potential Amnesty International supporters had was, how does change happen? And so what our sort of moral case we're making when we have an ad like this is basically, this could happen to you. So you should protect these people's human rights because one day it could be your human rights. And the other appeal is basically guilt, right? That you'll feel bad if you don't act because these people will be suffering. And so the problem here is populists are very effective because they obviously are very good at triggering fear, but what they also do is reach people's aspirations. They give people a sense of belonging. So Hannah Arendt, for example, in The Origins of Totalitarianism wrote that actually the foundation of totalitarianism is loneliness. And what all populists have been really good is giving people a sense of belonging to something bigger than themselves. So this, $1 made in China cap, no matter, the fact that it was made in China, it should have been a story, right? Not at all. People just love to have this sense of belonging. This having this cap makes you part of the gang. And even today, you'll hear, say, for example, in Arizona, you'll hear Latino voters, so male Latino voters, continuing to support Trump because they want to be rich one day too. And that's when we only appeal to people's fear, we're failing. Not only are we triggering the wrong emotions, the wrong emotional response we need if we want people to work together, to have solidarity, to care for each other, we're also failing to reach people's aspirations, which is actually a much more powerful tool than fear. So pro-life movement, this is a pro-life movement rally. So there's research being done in the pro-life movement in the United States to try and find out what is driving these people to be so fervently, why do people vote for Donald Trump, for example, purely because they wanted a pro-life judge on the Supreme Court? Why did they put this one issue ahead of their own economic interests? And their research found that people didn't join the pro-life movement because they were against a woman's right to choose. It was because a friend of theirs in the community would invite them to a barbecue, and then they would make friends and connections, and they would go back. And essentially, what the researcher called Ziad Munson said is that community forms the values. So they don't start out with the values. It's your community, the people who are influential and you respect, whether it's your teacher, your priest, a politician, a local politician. And so activities that build community, a lot of the time we just think of those as, like a fundraising activity, but actually things that bring people together are important, not just for, say, for like a mass movement. They're important for forming our values. So here's an example in Italy of a protest against Matteo Salvini. It's called the Sardines movement because people would cram squares. The problem is they were organizing themselves wherever Salvini went, they would go. And Salvini himself said, oh, actually, I quite like this because there's more attention for my rallies now. So the challenge is, if people just organize themselves based on what they're against, they're still defining themselves by that. And so there's a lot of people who, they're not happy to see the rise of racism and discrimination. They want to help refugees and migrants, but they need to be mobilized around something they can be for, around aspirations. So a really good example of this is Switzerland. There's a group called Operation Libero who mobilized to respond to all the extreme referenda that the far right party kept putting up. Say, like, we should pull Switzerland out of the ECHR, for example. But a crucial thing to know about how Operation Libero work is it's not just about issue by issue. It was about what they themselves stood for, which they call it patriotic liberalism. So like a vision of their country's values is about being, liberal and accepting and tolerant. But look at the details. You can see the woman holding up her bag is wearing pink Operation Libero socks. She's holding up an Operation Libero bag. The guy next to her has a little badge. And so the key thing that we need to start realizing is these little symbols, these things, a sense of belonging, these are really important for building up the values that drive support for specific concrete policies. And we hope to achieve change for human rights based on support for that principle. But I think what we need to have learned from the last few years in Europe is we also every day have to do the work to build up the support for those principles. So protection and promotion for me are not different. They go together every day. You can't separate them into separate things. By promoting human rights, we're also working on their protection. This is it's called Stefan Schwartz has done this sort of breakout, breaking down the various kind of values. And there's to really summarize what this graph is on the left, sort of in the kind of red purple colors, are what he calls extrinsic values, and on the right are intrinsic values. And I like to actually think of these in the same upstairs downstairs where I talked about the brain. So the downstairs extrinsic values is basically like showing off. We want to be seen as successful, like we've got a great car. I want to show all the people I went to school with that they were wrong to call me a nerd because now I'm doing really well. But also in terms of those appeals to support human rights, right? That actually I give money to charity, I'm a good person in my community, or also just simple security, right? I want to protect other people's freedom of speech because I am worried about my own freedom of speech. This kind of argument where, we have to stop a Donald Trump or a PIJ party taking away our freedoms because we're going to end up in an unfree state. We have to appeal to people's desire to create something better. We can together change this. We can create a better society. And those are the intrinsic values. So that's the upstairs brain. That's where we talk about people's desire to, say, protect the environment, to have good relations with our friends, friendship, loyalty. And so what we want to think about with human rights is, can we move beyond that appeal to self-interest? You should protect human rights because it's in your own good. Imagine if these were your rights. To this is a crucial thing from his research is how we treat each other. I'll show you one sort of step we did with this with human rights at Amnesty International. So we did this research to try and identify, rather than sort of tackling the myths, right? All the attacks on human rights. What is it when people like human rights? What is it about human rights that they like? And let's emphasize it. So in France in particular, we found people wanted to be part of something successful, but all the constant stories of, abuse and the sense of our own messaging that things are going back to the 30s, things are worse than ever, was making people less likely to act. It was making them more despondent. And it was all about showing that human rights wins. Remember that again, that upstairs brain we want to trigger, one of the most powerful things that can trigger that part of the brain is joy. And obviously the vast majority of human rights work is not about joy, but what we can give people is the aspiration, the sense of the promise of joy. If we do the hard work, this is what it can result in. And so I'm showing you content here that's very campaigny, but I just also want to re-emphasize my point that this is one way to easily just show it to you, but it's not only something that can be done in campaigning. So for example, a bold policy call, like the Green New Deal, you can't have a campaigny video like this without a concrete idea behind it. This is not just about, comms and campaigning. It's about the ideas that we put forward. It's about the research we do and, the way we frame policy asks or any other piece of work we do. But so how does human rights make change happen? So right now, if you were to Google human rights, you tend to come up with very either abstract or negative imagery. So on the right, you'll see a picture that's very much about the absence of human rights. Your top left is, obviously the holding up of the charter of the UDHR. And the bottom left is an emoticon, an emoji that Twitter designed for Human Rights Day, which while it's, hands and love, it doesn't quite tell you how does human rights actually make that change happen. And so Anat Shenker-Osorio has done this amazing research, which I really recommend everyone read. Basically, she says that when we talk about that, human rights as an object that you are given or that's taken away from you, migrants' rights are being abused, for example, right? So first of all, we use this passive tense. So we actually don't name the perpetrator. It makes it sound like it's just this natural thing that's happening. It almost makes it sound like it's their fault that they've made it happen. Women are victims of domestic violence at incredible rates. It makes it sound like this is just this thing that's happening in society. We name the people who are responsible for it. We say there's a certain kind of behavior bringing about the problem, and they can change their behavior to make it better. But crucially, it's very unempowering. There's no agency for the people who are actually involved. They're just having their rights, their entitlements. They're just having something given to them or taken away from them. There's not much agency. And particularly, we can see so many social movements today I find it really troubling that they rarely use the language of human rights. And when they do, they just say healthcare is a human right. We don't talk about human rights as a way to actually make things better. It's just the thing we want, or the thing we want to be given to us by governments. So she says we should talk about human rights as a way of living our lives. Human rights is like the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Human rights is about how we treat each other. Here's an example of how this is a problem. This idea of human rights as a menu of entitlements that we should have given to us. When you actually ask people to list what are the most important rights, and I'm sure you've seen surveys like this before, to me this is very damaging for our wider cause. It might help us in terms of freedom of speech, but once you talk about human rights as this menu of things we should be given by our government, you'll see, for example, that asylum and the right to move come very low down the list. And you'll hear this idea. So I mentioned last time this idea of human rights, something for criminals. There's this idea that human rights is an entitlement and that people are starting to ask for too much, that this idea has gone too far. And so what we're starting to look at now is, can we talk about human rights differently? So if you're explaining human rights, say a 6-year-old or even anyone else, but just someone who doesn't actually know what they are, if you're giving, say, a young person who's part of Fridays for Future, for example, or Black Lives Matter, I'm giving you human rights. This is a tool you can use to improve your society. What's in the box? What is this tool? Just trying to think metaphorically, right? How does human rights make change happen? So for example, corruption, you'd say transparency is like a broom that sweeps up corruption. Or there's this idea that sunlight disinfects, for example. So that's one example of a metaphor. A lot of the time when we talk about human rights as that protection, so we use this idea of like an umbrella, right? Human rights is something that we have to protect us. Particularly, it's this idea of having it, we need to have it for a rainy day. So, right, in case one day someone comes along and takes your rights, you want these protections in place. And actually, the logo on the right is an insurance company, because actually that discourse, that narrative around human rights is very much that of an insurance company. Let's have these rights just in case. Whereas once we start actually thinking about the work we want to do and our vision, what we're trying to achieve with human rights, suddenly people start talking about human rights as glue that binds us together in shared humanity. Or human rights is something that we use to nurture. It's like the watering can we use to nurture a better society. We start to have the images of gardens, right? Of we're trying to keep out the weeds of repression and trying to build up a kind of society. So what does that look like again in the practice of the daily work of human rights? So Amnesty International Denmark, for example, were part of a Europe-wide campaign to sort of implement the Istanbul Convention and fight domestic violence. They wanted to shift from saying no means no, which is the kind of traditional message there, to focus to shift to yes. So part of it, this was a great example of solutions-based research. So they gave survivors of sexual violence more of a voice in the process. They worked on them developing the recommendations, but then also when they went to decision makers, particularly male ones, it wasn't just about what you have to stop doing. So very much thinking of behavior here. It's not about, men need to stop doing it, but also what men can positively do. So you can ensure you have consent, for example. This is a way we can start to shift the way work we do on human rights to talk about what we want to see happening. And that also gave politicians the opportunity to do something good, like with a sort of positive change. We can ensure freedom, that women have the freedom to walk down the street at night. And even conservative politicians then, rather than it becoming one of these cultural issues, were given a way in, that opportunity to act on their intrinsic values. Coronavirus is a really great example of this on a behavioral level. I mentioned this again last time, that when we tell people, you're bad if you're going out, you're harming people, the most effective appeals to people have been stay home, protect others. You're helping your community, you're helping your loved ones. And also things that appeals, to humor, that were creative and cultural, focusing on the things we can do. So the opportunity to change rather than the threat of yourself getting sick. So I'll end this presentation with a few examples of where I've been trying to take this in terms of what's the story we do tell with human rights, right? So what do we talk to people when we're trying to explain what human rights are? So I've started using Facebook advertisements to run A/B tests. So these are tests where you run the same content, but with different messaging. And you see, does this work better if I say, word A or word B which one is more effective. And this is actually a tool that populists have been using all over the world to refine their messages of hate. So should I run a racist campaign against, say, protesters, or should I run a racist campaign against migrants? And they'll see which one is more effective. So we're trying to use this to see how can we make our positive, hopeful message more effective. So here I was testing, we commissioned graphics to make something that would work in a lot of different parts of the world. And on the left, you'll see sort of more like values-based messaging, and on the right was messages based on that sort of traditional way of talking about human rights that I mentioned. And I was really surprised to find that this message based on shared humanity was the most effective. And I have to say, I myself didn't actually like this video at first. Like I said before, I'm used to writing hard-hitting press releases describing the abuses that took place. But so what I learned is, first of all, not to trust my own instincts, that we have to develop our efforts to reach people based on who the audience is, but also that there is actually this hunger for messaging, for content, for people to go out and speak to these bigger values. And so that's an example of building your messaging around a value, that the value becomes humanity. So I imagine it feels a bit uncomfortable to sort of stray into this territory. It feels like, oh, am I really going to achieve an advocacy success or really shift the debate by talking about things like empathy and compassion? Aren't these decisions really made based on economics and security and votes? But at the end of the day, politicians, remember that Overton window, they go with what is seen as common sense in their community. And the point is, if we never build the case for what we want based on our worldview, then our worldview will never move to that center ground where it's common sense. What we're not going to get to in this course is testing. So the way we do it is testing. And actually, again, messages of hate and division are not natural either. Anthropologists have shown that human nature is to work together and in groups. The point is they've become very good at testing how to make those hateful messages work. And so what we have to do is test, once we know what that message is that you've been articulating now, we then start testing how actually you do focus groups and you see, well, how will it cut through? And the same applies to advocacy meetings. Every person, any politician, any decision maker, any bureaucrat also has a value system and an identity and a lived experience that you can appeal to. So what we try to do with the hope-based shifts is to find wherever we've got a negative, can we shift, and like what's the unspoken positive? So what I'd encourage you to keep thinking about is how. So what is this tool that we've used? How have we left the suffering behind? And if we don't have suffering, what do we have instead? What's the opposite of suffering? And how do human rights allow us to have that? And I know these are difficult questions, and they may not be like the brunt of our main message, but it's the underlying ideas that we want to try and get across.